Caroline Reed tied a pale ribbon around the last jar of peach preserves she would ever leave on Martin Hayes's porch. The peaches had cooked down before sunrise, turning the color of late summer light. She had skimmed the foam, tested the syrup on a cold spoon, and sealed the jar exactly as Ruth Hayes had taught her 12 years earlier. Patience, Ruth had once said, peaches tell you when they're ready. Caroline had remembered the lesson. She had simply applied it too long to a man. She laid the old recipe card beneath the square of clean muslin covering the lid. Ruth's handwriting filled the front. On the back, Caroline had added one line. You knew where to find me. She did not sign it. The path across the meadow was silver with dew. For 3 summers she had crossed that distance carrying preserves, usually on a Thursday. Martin would meet her at the porch, remove his hat, and thank her as carefully as though kindness were a debt. A week later, the empty jar would appear on her fence post, polished clear, with a folded note beneath it. Much obliged. Fine batch. Kind of you to remember. Never once had he written, come sit a while. Caroline set the jar beside his door. Through the window, she could see his coffee cup and his hat hanging from a chair. He was home. She could have knocked. Instead, she straightened the ribbon and walked back across the meadow. By noon, 2 crates stood open in her front room. Caroline wrapped plates in newspaper and stacked account books beside the hearth. Her cousin James had offered her a place at the boarding house he planned to purchase outside St. Joseph. He needed someone who could keep inventories, preserve food, bargain for supplies, and make a house run without waste. Caroline had asked for 3 days to consider it. She had taken one, across the meadow. Martin opened his door after repairing the south fence and found the jar catching sunlight on the porch rail. He picked it up with both hands. The ribbon should have warned him. Caroline had never tied ribbons around food meant for neighbors, but habit was a powerful kind of blindness. He carried the jar inside and told himself she had been too busy to stay. Then he rode into town for salt blocks and hinge nails. At the feed store, Amos Bell was pinning a notice beside the seed calendar. Martin recognized the name before he read the rest. Reed Homestead House, Orchard, Water Rights, and 32 acres. Private sale. Inquire with Caroline Reed. His hand tightened around the packet of nails. When did she decide this? Notice came yesterday, Amos said. Her cousin's buying. She'll be east before the month turns. 6 days. Martin knew because the stage left for the rail line every Monday, and this was Tuesday. He paid without counting his change and rode home hard enough to lather the bay's neck. The jar waited beside the sink, warm from the window light. He reached for a spoon, then stopped. The pale ribbon lay too neatly against the muslin. Martin pulled it loose. The cloth shifted, and a stiff rectangle of paper slid onto the floor. He knew Ruth's recipe card at once. Its corners were soft with age. The ink faded where her thumb had rested. He unfolded it too quickly, creasing one edge, and found Caroline's writing on the back. You knew where to find me. The jar struck the porch rail when he carried it outside, chipping the glass near the base. Martin barely noticed. Across the meadow, Caroline's front door stood open. One packed crate waited on the wagon. 6 days remained before the sale. For the first time in 3 years, Martin understood that the preserves had never asked him to remember the woman he had lost. They had asked whether he could choose the woman still waiting, and Caroline had stopped waiting. Martin crossed the meadow before Caroline had finished nailing the first crate shut. She saw him through the open door, carrying the chipped jar in one hand and the folded recipe card in the other. Mud darkened his trouser cuffs. He had come in a hurry, but when he reached the porch, he stopped as though the final step belonged to her. Caroline kept the hammer in her hand. You found it. I did. He held out the jar. I'm sorry about the chip. She set it among the dishes waiting to be packed. Glass survives less than people think. Martin looked into the front room. The blue curtains were down. Her mother's walnut clock sat wrapped in a blanket. 2 shelves stood empty except for pale squares where jars and books had kept the wood from fading. Amos said you're selling. That is what the notice says. You might have told me. Caroline drove another nail into the crate lid. I have been telling you things for 3 years. The blow landed squarely. Martin did not pretend to misunderstand. He asked whether the buyer had inspected the outbuildings. Caroline said her cousin knew the place, but the shed door had sagged after the spring thaw. I can set it right before he comes. You don't owe me a repaired door. No. Then why offer? His eyes moved to the jar. Because it needs doing. It was not the answer she wanted, but it was honest. Caroline handed him the toolbox. Martin lifted the door from its hinges while Caroline planed the swollen edge. He started to take the plane from her, then stopped when she adjusted the blade and shaved the wood clean in 3 long strokes. By the time the hinges sat straight, the door closed without dragging. That'll hold, Martin said. It already did. It only needed correcting. Caroline picked up a coil of wire and headed toward the orchard. Martin followed. The western irrigation gate had been losing water for a week. Caroline knelt beside the ditch, pressed 2 fingers into the damp soil, and watched the current slip beneath the warped board. Nearly a quarter of the flow is escaping here. Another hot week and the north row will start dropping fruit. I can replace the gate. We can brace it today. A replacement would take lumber I've included in the sale inventory. The word stopped his hands for half a second. Caroline measured the gap with a folded strip of cloth, cut a willow brace, and directed Martin where to set the iron spike. When the brace tightened, the lost stream narrowed to a thread, then stopped. Water reached the last peach trees before noon. Martin looked down the rows. Every basin had been cleared, every trunk whitewashed against sun damage, every branch thinned so the fruit would not split the wood. You did all this alone? With hired help at harvest? That wasn't what I asked. Then yes. He looked toward the house, where the open crates waited. You don't have to sell because the work is too much. I am not selling because the work is too much. The truth left him with nowhere to place his concern. Inside, Caroline added the chip jar to a kitchen crate, but Martin lifted it out. Not that one. It won't travel east well. Then leave it here. She met his eyes. You have kept enough empty jars? Before he could answer, hoofbeats sounded along the road. A telegraph boy brought an envelope addressed to Caroline. She broke the seal with her thumb. James's train had made better time than expected. He would arrive Friday morning. The clerk could have the deed prepared that afternoon. Caroline read the final line twice. The 6 days Martin thought he had were gone. 3 remained. By Wednesday morning, Caroline had 3 rooms packed and a list of everything that would remain with the property. Martin arrived while she was standing at the orchard fence with a measuring chain stretched between 2 posts. She had tied her hair back with a plain strip of cloth, and the hem of her work dress was dark from the irrigation ditch. You came early, she said. I thought the clerk might need the boundary figures. The clerk has figures. Caroline pulled the chain tight. Whether they are the right ones is another matter. The descriptions sent from town listed the Reed place as 26 cultivated acres, 6 rough acres, 1 house, 1 barn, and ordinary creek access. Caroline had read it twice before noticing what was missing. The spring channel feeding the orchard was not ordinary creek access. Her father had paid to stone its lower bank, and Caroline had spent 7 years keeping the gate, ditch, and settling basin clear. Without that channel, half the trees would not survive a dry August. The document also described the northern orchard as uncultivated ground. Martin looked through the fence at 2 straight rows of peach trees heavy with fruit. Who wrote that? A clerk who copied an older tax description? That could lower the price. It could lower the value on paper. The land itself has not changed. She handed him one end of the chain. They measured the orchard row by row, then walked the spring channel to the stone marker near the cottonwoods. Caroline recorded each distance in a small black account book. The book's cloth cover had faded brown at the corners, and a dark water stain spread across the lower edge from years of being carried beside the ditch. Martin held the chain where she told him and did not offer to take over. At the northern fence, Caroline stopped beside a buried survey stone and cleared the dirt with her boot heel. There, Martin crouched. That marker puts the irrigated line 12 yards beyond the clerk's description. 14 at the western corner. She showed him the calculation: orchard acreage, spring access, expected yield, and the value of the packed fruit already stored in the shed. You keep accounts on every row. I keep accounts on anything someone may later pretend was never there. Martin looked at her, but Caroline had already closed the book. They rode into town before noon. The land clerk, Mr. Pritchard, spread the draft deed across his desk and adjusted his spectacles. These descriptions have been used for years. Miss Reed. That does not make them accurate. He pointed to the copied tax map. The county recognizes 26 cultivated acres. The county collected orchard tax on 30 for the past 4 years. Caroline placed her account book beside the deed, then laid down the tax receipts, a seed order, and the original spring channel agreement signed by her father. Pritchard examined the papers. Martin stood near the door without speaking. Caroline traced the boundary line with one finger. The northern rows appear in the tax assessment, the fruit shipments, and the irrigation agreement. Either the county has taxed land that does not exist, or this description is incomplete. The clerk removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. I will compare it with the survey register. I already did. Page 112. He opened the heavy register behind his desk. Dust rose from the binding. On page 112, the old measurements matched Caroline's figures within 2 feet. Pritchard drew a line through the draft description. I'll prepare a correction. The new valuation was 40% higher than the first. Martin should have felt relief. Caroline had protected what she built. No buyer could take the orchard cheaply or dismiss her work as a few trees beside an old house. Instead, the corrected deed made the sale harder to stop. James would not be purchasing a burden out of family duty. He would be buying productive land at a fair price, and Caroline would leave with enough money to enter the boarding house as a partner rather than a dependent cousin. Outside the office, Martin said, you knew exactly where the mistake was. I have known what this place is worth for years. I did not mean only the land. Caroline folded the corrected description and placed it inside her account book. Before she could answer, Pritchard called her back. He handed her the completed deed draft in a cream-colored envelope from the stage office. Her reservation had been confirmed. The coach would leave Saturday afternoon, less than 3 hours after the signing. Caroline slipped the ticket behind the deed. Martin saw the date. 2 days remained, and this time there would be no empty jar waiting after she was gone. Thursday evening found Caroline on a ladder above the orchard shed, fastening the last of the storm shutters before dark. Martin steadied the ladder from below. The sky beyond the western ridge had turned the color of iron, though the air remained hot. You should eat before dark, he said. I have bread. That is not supper. Caroline drove the nail flush. You have become particular all at once. Martin looked away toward the meadow. Come to my place. I have stew enough for 2. She nearly refused. Then the first low roll of thunder crossed the mountains, and she climbed down. Martin's kitchen was cleaner than most ranch kitchens and emptier than a house should have been. He set out beef stew, biscuits, and coffee. Caroline sat where Ruth once kept a basket of mending, though Martin had moved the basket years ago. For a few minutes they spoke of the weather, the loose cottonwood by the creek, and whether the north orchard row would hold. It was the kind of conversation they had always managed well. Martin rose for more coffee and opened the pantry. Caroline saw the jars. 3 empty peach preserve jars stood in a row on the upper shelf, each one polished clear. Beneath them lay her folded thank you notes, tied together with kitchen twine. The chipped final jar sat apart near the flour bin. You kept them, she said. Martin did not turn around. They were good jars. You returned them. Not all of them. She crossed the room and lifted the first jar. A tiny blue mark near the rim identified the batch from 3 summers ago. The second still carried a faint scratch from Caroline's canning rack. The third had a lid Martin had cleaned until the metal shone. He had saved proof of every summer she had crossed the meadow. Why, she asked. Martin set down the coffee pot. The storm pressed against the windows without yet breaking. In that waiting silence, Caroline heard the clock above the stove. Martin touched the neck of the oldest jar. Ruth taught you that recipe. Caroline's hand tightened around the glass. Yes, she was proud when your first batch sealed. I remember. They brought her back to mind. The words were gentle. That made them worse. Caroline placed the jar on the table before she dropped it. I did not leave them here for Ruth. Martin's face changed, but he said nothing. I respected her. Caroline continued. I loved her dearly, but she has been gone 6 years, and I have been crossing that meadow for 3. I know. Do you? He stepped toward her. Caroline. No. You do not get to say my name as though that is the same as an answer. The first rain struck the roof in broad, scattered drops. She pointed toward the pantry. You kept every jar. You kept every note. You noticed when I came and when I did not. Yet each time I gave you something of myself, You polished the glass and sent it back empty. I thought distance was the decent thing. For whom? Martin opened his mouth, then closed it. Caroline picked up her shawl. He moved near the door, not blocking it, but close enough that she had to look at him. You are 30, he said. I am 57. People have always said something. I have already had a life. So have I. You deserve a man who can give you years. I deserve the truth from the man I chose. The rain strengthened. Water ran down the windows in crooked lines. Martin looked toward the pantry again, at the jars he had hidden away like private evidence. I did not want to make you carry an old man's grief. Caroline's voice softened, but not her meaning. You let me carry his silence instead. She stepped around him and opened the door. Across the meadow, a wagon appeared along the ridge road, its canvas cover pale against the darkening sky. Caroline recognized James's team before the driver raised a hand. Her cousin had arrived a day early. Martin stood behind her with the kitchen light spilling around his boots. While the wagon descended toward the Reed place, and the space between them suddenly became measured not in acres, but in hours. James Reed reached the house before the full storm broke. He embraced Caroline, shook Martin's hand, and glanced toward the orchard as wind bent the cottonwoods. You said the weather held out here, James called. It did until it changed. The first hail struck the porch roof. Caroline tied back her skirt and pointed toward the shed. James moved the packed crates from the west wall. Martin, bring the brace poles. The north row will split first. They ran. Rain crossed the meadow in silver sheets. Water spilled over the upper ditch. The weakened gate shuddered, and Peaches hit the ground with heavy thumps. Martin caught Caroline when the mud shifted beneath her boots. The ditch is rising too fast. I can see that. You stay with the crates. I'll take the gate. She pulled free and pushed the lantern into his hand. You do what I tell you, or you go home. Martin stared at her for one breath, then nodded. Caroline sent him to drive a second spike through the willow brace, while she cut a drainage channel with a shovel. James dragged the packed fruit beneath the inner roof. Wind tore one shutter loose and split its hinge. The north row bowed beneath water and fruit. Poles, Caroline shouted. Martin carried them two at a time. She chose which limbs could be saved, where each brace should stand, and which branches had to be cut before they tore the trunks apart. Every order cost fruit. Delay would cost trees. Hail bruised her hands. Mud soaked the pale cloth Martin had wrapped around the final jar and recipe card inside his coat. Beyond the fence, the creek clawed at the bridge approach. For nearly an hour, they worked without wasting breath. When the hail softened to rain, most of the orchard still stood. The northern row had lost half its fruit and two heavy branches, but the trunks remained whole. Water followed Caroline's new channel into the lower pasture. James leaned on his shovel. You saved the crop. Most of it. Martin removed his hat. She saved the trees. I only put the poles where she ordered. James looked between them but said nothing. There are moments when people finally see the strength they have been leaning on without naming it. Sometimes the hardest question is not whether we love someone, but whether we have honored what they carried for us. Have you ever recognized a person's worth only when they began to walk away? After James returned to check the crates, Carolyn and Martin worked along the damaged fence. The storm moved east, leaving broken leaves and runoff behind. Martin reset a loosened post, delayed the signing. For how long? Until the orchard is repaired. The orchard is not why I am leaving. You should not decide after a night like this. I decided before the clouds came. The north row needs work. I know. I can help. Caroline stopped twisting the wire. That is what you always offer. A gate repaired, a fence straightened, a jar returned clean. You choose every kindness that lets you leave the real question untouched. His hands went still. I came because you were in danger. I was working in hail beside a flooded ditch, and I saved what could be saved. Martin looked across the braced limbs and diverted water. I know you did. Then do not ask me to stay because a storm frightened you. I am frightened by Saturday. At last, the truth stood between them. Caroline's eyes filled, but her voice stayed level. Then be frightened honestly. Martin drew the cloth and card from his coat. The muslin was stained with mud, and rain had darkened one corner of the paper. You gave me time, he said. I gave you 3 years. I thought wanting you would be selfish. Accepting what I gave while refusing to answer was selfish. He lowered his head. Caroline tied off the wire and tested the fence. It held. Across the orchard, James had lit the lamps inside her half-packed house. The rooms glowed through windows stripped of curtains. "I ride to town at sunrise," she said. "The clerk expects me before noon." Martin stepped closer, the damaged card trembling once between his fingers. "Caroline," she faced him. "I will not trade my land, my future, or my name for one night of frightened kindness." Then she took the shovel and walked toward the house, leaving Martin beside the broken row with one night to decide whether he would finally speak. By dawn, the storm had stripped the sky clean. Caroline stood beside the wagon in a dark traveling dress, fastening the last trunk beneath a canvas sheet. James checked the harness. The orchard behind them dripped steadily, its braced branches casting long shadows across the mud. Martin came through the lower gate carrying the chip jar. The ribbon was gone. Mud had dried along the muslin cover, and the recipe card lay pressed flat beneath his palm. One corner had softened from rain. James looked at Caroline. "I'll give you a minute." He led the team toward the road. Martin stopped several feet away. He had changed his wet shirt, but his boots were still caked with orchard mud. "I knew," he said. Caroline did not ask what he meant. "I knew the jars were not only about Ruth, maybe not the first one. By the second summer, I knew." The admission hurt more than another excuse would have. "You understood," she said, and still sent them back. "I polished them because I did not know what else to do with something that mattered. You could have spoken. I wrote notes. You wrote around the truth." "Yes." The word came without defense. Martin set the chip jar on the wagon bed. "Every Thursday you crossed that meadow. I listened for the gate. When winter came, I counted months until peaches. I kept the jars because returning all of them felt like closing a door. But you closed it anyway." I stood behind it. Caroline looked toward the road, where James waited beside the team. Martin unfolded the recipe card. The wet paper resisted, and a thin edge tore beneath his thumb. He stopped immediately, holding the pieces together so Ruth's faded writing and Caroline's single line remained legible. "I told myself I was protecting you from talk," he said. "Then I told myself I was protecting Ruth's memory. After that, I used my age because it sounded respectable." "And what were you protecting?" "Myself." The morning wind moved through the battered peach leaves. Martin continued. "I was afraid you would wake one day and see an old man where you had once seen a future. I was more afraid you would say yes, and I would have something worth losing again." Caroline pressed one hand against the wagon rail. "That fear did not keep me safe. No, it kept me waiting. For 3 years, she had imagined hearing him say it. The words brought relief, but they did not restore the mornings, the unanswered visits, or the dignity she had surrendered a little at a time. "What do you want from me now?" she asked. "Nothing you do not choose." Martin looked toward town. "Go to the clerk. Read the deed. Make the decision you intended to make." Her face tightened. "Then why did you come?" "To tell you before you left that I loved you badly. But I loved you. And to ask you properly where you are free to answer." Caroline glanced at James. He had turned his back, giving them privacy without pretending not to understand. Martin picked up the jar again. "I will ride to town separately. I will ask in front of your cousin and the clerk, so there can be no secret promise and no claim that I stopped you on the road. I will say the land is yours. The choice is yours. If you refuse me, I will not question the sale. And if I do not, then I will cross the meadow every day until you believe one crossing was not panic." Caroline's eyes burned. She climbed onto the wagon seat without offering him an answer. James turned the team toward town. The deed, account book, and stage ticket rested inside Caroline's satchel. Martin mounted after they disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. He carried the chip jar in a saddlebag and tucked the damaged recipe card inside his coat. By the time he reached the creek road, sunlight had touched the church steeple in town. Then his horse stopped. The bridge itself still stood, but the storm had washed away half the eastern approach. Brown water churned through the gap where the road had been. From town, faint across the distance, the first warning bell before noon began to ring. Martin had 3 hours when Caroline left the ranch. Now the direct road was gone. Martin turned the bay away from the ruined bridge and took the stock trail north. The route climbed behind the cottonwood ridge and doubled the distance to town. Mud sucked at the horses' hooves. Twice Martin dismounted to lead him through washouts where the storm had carved new channels across the trail. The second warning bell carried over the hills. At the land office, Caroline sat across from Mr. Pritchard with the corrected deed open before her. James stood near the window. Two witnesses waited beside the wall, hats held against their chests. Pritchard dipped his pen. The property description has been corrected. The purchase price is entered here, and the transfer becomes effective upon your signature and those of the witnesses. Caroline opened her account book one last time. The water-stained cover rested beneath her palm. She checked the acreage, spring rights, orchard rows, house, barn, and payment. Every line was fair. James placed the stage ticket beside her satchel. There is still time to reach the coach. Caroline nodded and took the pen. Outside, hoofbeats struck the street hard enough to turn heads. Martin entered with mud to his knees and his breath uneven from the ride. He carried the chipped preserve jar in one hand. The damaged recipe card showed between the fingers of the other. Pritchard rose. "Mr. Hayes, this is a private transaction." "I know." Martin looked only at Caroline. "I came to say what I should have said before any of you were asked to wait." Caroline set the pen down, but she did not rise. Martin placed the jar on the clerk's desk. The chipped base clicked against the wood. "I am not here to contest this deed. The Reed land belongs to Caroline. Her work made it valuable, and her judgment brought it to this table on fair terms." The witnesses glanced toward one another. Martin continued before courage could turn back into courtesy. "For 3 years, she crossed a meadow carrying more than preserves. I knew it. I accepted every kindness and answered with notes that cost me nothing." Caroline's hand rested beside the unsigned line. Martin unfolded the recipe card carefully. Its torn edge separated for an instant, but the words remained whole. "She wrote that I knew where to find her. That is true. I knew every Thursday. I knew through every winter when the jars were gone. I knew when I heard her gate and saw her lamp after dark." His voice roughened. "I let my grief, my age, and other people's possible judgment sound more honorable than fear. They were not. I was afraid to love her openly, and she paid the price for my silence." No one in the office moved. Martin faced Caroline fully. "I am 57. I cannot promise you the years a younger man might. I can promise not to hide the years I have. I will not ask you to give up your land, your accounts, your name, or the work that made this place yours." He removed his hat. "I'm asking whether you would let me build a life beside yours. Not over it, not in place of it, beside it." Caroline studied him while rainwater fell from his coat onto the floorboards. "And if I sign," she asked, "I will help load your trunks. I will see you to the stage. Then I will live with the answer I earned." James looked down. Pritchard capped the ink bottle. Caroline lifted the pen again. Martin's fingers tightened around his hat brim. She drew the deed toward her. Then she turned it face down. "Mr. Pritchard, put it away." The clerk blinked. "You are declining the transfer." "I am declining it today." James searched her expression. "Because he came." Caroline looked at Martin. "Because he finally came without trying to make the choice for me." James exhaled, then picked up the stage ticket and tore it through the date. Martin did not step toward her until she stood. Caroline touched the chipped jar. "One ride through mud does not mend 3 years. No. One truthful speech does not make you practiced at truth. No. You will have to cross that meadow again tomorrow." Martin's eyes lifted to hers. "What time?" "After sunrise." Caroline took the recipe card from his hand and folded it along the old crease. Then she placed it inside her stained account book, where the evidence of what she had built rested beside the evidence of what he had nearly lost. The sale had stopped. Whether Martin's silence had truly ended would be decided in the ordinary mornings that followed. Martin crossed the meadow after sunrise the next morning. He came without the jar, without a speech, and without pretending the walk was accidental. He brought a hammer, 2 lengths of seasoned wood, and a question. "Which trees do you want braced first?" Caroline pointed toward the damaged northern row. That was how the new beginning started, not with another promise, but with work done under her direction. Through the last weeks of summer, Martin crossed the meadow openly. Some mornings he helped reset the orchard fence. Other days he carried accounts to town, then returned them without adding a figure or questioning one of Caroline's decisions. When neighbors asked whether the Reed place had been sold, he answered that Caroline had chosen to keep it. He never said she had stayed for him. She noticed that. The sale notice remained beside the gate until Caroline took it down herself. Martin held the ladder. He did not touch the paper until she handed it to him. "Burn it," he asked. "No. Put it in the account book." The notice joined the unsigned deed, the torn stage ticket, and the rain-stained recipe card. Caroline mounted the card on clean backing, leaving its creases and damaged edge visible. Ruth's handwriting remained on one side. "You knew where to find me" remained on the other. Beside it, Martin placed a note of his own. It was longer than every thank you he had written before. "I know where to find you. I will not wait for Thursday." Caroline read it twice, then kept it. Martin began courting Caroline in the plainest ways he knew. He arrived when he said he would. He stayed for supper when invited. He spoke Ruth's name without turning Caroline into a keeper of memory, and he listened when Caroline explained that love offered freely was not the same as love endlessly available. By winter, they had agreed that neither ranch would be surrendered. The meadow would remain between the houses, but Martin no longer used distance as shelter. He crossed it in snow, in spring mud, and once beneath a rain so light, Caroline watched him come without an umbrella. The following August filled the orchard with peaches again. Caroline stood in Martin's kitchen, testing syrup on a cold spoon while he wiped the rims of fresh jars. The pantry shelf no longer held empty glass like evidence of all he had failed to say. It held flour, coffee, and preserves they had made together. Martin placed a full jar beside 2 spoons on the porch table. "Come sit a while," he said. Caroline looked at him over her shoulder. It was a small invitation. It was also 3 years late. She went anyway. On the windowsill stood the old chipped jar, too damaged now for canning. Caroline had filled it with peach blossoms from the restored northern row. The faded ribbon lay beneath it, and the repaired recipe card rested safely inside her recipe box. Beyond the porch, afternoon light stretched across the meadow between their 2 homes. The distance had not disappeared. It had simply stopped being an excuse. The jar that had carried goodbye across the meadow held peach blossoms now, because this time Martin had crossed the distance himself.